I've had discussions with different ministers over the years, and one thing that I wonder about, and I'm curious to have your take on this, do you think being pastoral and being prophetic are separate gifts?
Mm. Yeah. Passive. Boy, that is a good question. Yes, I
They
think they are.
okay.
Yeah, I think they're separate. I know people that are both, but I also know people who are really good at being prophetic, but terrible at being pastoral.
Hmm.
And that's been frustrating for me to deal with people because my expectations are that if they're prophetic, then they're naturally pastoral.
Right.
And I mean, yeah.
Well, you just don't see
Rec-
it always.
Recently, I've had a discussion with a guy, and I kept waiting for him to be pastoral, and he just never did. He was just like totally narcissistic, and he was just like, I don't really want to talk about you. We're done.
Oh
And he
wow.
didn't say it that way, but he was just like he just talked right over me and just went
Wow.
on. And yeah, so I think those are two separate gifts. Yeah, for me, that's my perspective.
Hmm.
But they can be held and practiced by one individual.
Yeah.
Yes, and those are special people,
Okay.
I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because I was thinking about it because I tend to be labeled prophetic. And, because I speak truth to power, because I notice injustice and I say something about it. And I know that sometimes I'm perceived harshly, I guess I'll say that, but usually not, because I do this thing where if I'm telling someone a hard truth, like I tell hard truths in my sermons,
Right.
tell hard truths in Bible study, but I mix it with something uplifting. I kind of listen
Hmm.
to Dr. Frank Thomas, his celebration ending. Like you could tell the hard truth, bring it back to scripture, bring it back to scripture, bring it back to scripture, and end with something hopeful.
Right.
So to me, that is kind of being pastoral and prophetic. And, in our church, since he's a therapist, we have mental health moments, as you've seen in our
Oh
church
yeah.
services. But I kind of find that part of being prophetic is just naming reality and naming the truth of what we could do better. And so for me, that seems like something that every preaching pastor should be tackling.
But it really is difficult time to be a pastor because everything that I instinctually go back to in terms of my pastoral roots, because that my roots are not in the prophetic, my prophetic voice. My roots are in the pastoral voice. So that's my go-to. That's my like default setting.
Right.
And it's very difficult to pastor right now in terms of being pastoral because my go-to, hey, let's go and let's have group and let's talk and let's meet and let's do this, and everything is taken away. And I have to regroup and I have to go, all right, how do I be pastoral through YouTube? How do I be pastoral through Zoom? How do you do this? And I'm getting my sea legs underneath me a little bit more. I'm feeling more comfortable. But man, it's really odd being in that brick and mortar church that you guys don't have to worry about, which is awesome that you don't have to. But we're kind of in that setting now. How do you do ministry when you've got people sitting around with masks? And one of the things that is hard, this is just very basic stuff. How do you preach to people when you can't see their faces,
Yeah.
their mouths? How do you know? And you just see their eyes. It's just a very subtle thing, but I rely on when I preach. I rely on being able to see people's eyes and their mouth and
Right.
their facial expressions, and then that interaction is very organic when you're preaching, and it's taken away. So it's a total adjustment for me in terms of how to do it. And so I get done preaching and I'm like, okay,
I guess
I'm
that's
done. I'm done.
The end.
But the end, but
Bye.
yesterday I preached about Exodus, and I brought in, I tried to bring in some prophetic stuff without being political, and that is one of the most difficult things right now, because I've got people on both sides of the fence. And so I brought in, I was preaching on Exodus first chapter about the oppression of the people of Israel
Right.
by the Egyptians. And then I brought in the oppression during slavery in this country. And I talked about the Civil War, and I had stats, and I really leaned on that. To get my prophetic voice, I leaned on history,
Okay.
because I felt like, yeah, you can debate whether or not the politics of it, but you really can't debate this is what Lincoln did. This is the Dred Scott, because I talked about the Dred Scott decision in 57, and you can't really argue with those things. So I don't know how you're tackling being that prophetic voice without being political, because essentially it's impossible to
Um,
do.
I'll just be real. I'm being political.
There you go.
You know what? But one of the things that that takes me back to, like, instead of a pastoral versus prophetic argument, or like
Right.
position, people, I used to have that argument with people in seminary all the time. Like, should you be political from the pulpit? So here's my take on it. How can you not be political from the pulpit? And for me, let me define political. I'm not saying partisan. I'm not saying you should be pro-Democrat or pro-Republican from the pulpit, because that's not what it's about. But if you look at the definition of the word politics, what we have called it now are like all of the intricacies of government, but really political decisions and political discussions are based in how groups live together.
Right.
Defining, like, is there a group left behind? Is there oppression? Is there justice? Is there economic justice? Is there racial justice? Are we taking care of the whole society? And how are we taking care of the whole society? How are we sharing resources? How are we interacting together? So for me, if you look through politics through that lens, there's nothing else you should be talking about from the pulpit, because everything that we talk about from the pulpit is about how we live together.
Absolutely. And this is how I tackled it yesterday. I came to the apex of my sermon was me saying, if we're not connected with people who are being oppressed, we disconnect ourselves from God.
Word.
I mean, that's pretty much how I said, because everything you see in Scripture, Old Testament, New Testament, and then you get into Jesus Christ above all, in terms of with the Romans, in terms of the oppression. And you read John Dominique Crossan, and you read some of these guys that are really talking about a prophetic Jesus in the here and now, you realize that it was all about politics.
Right.
So I said this, and I got no reaction. But at the same time, I think it sunk in, because you have to sit here and say, if we're not addressing oppression, we disconnect ourselves from the very God who we serve. And when we don't get into this realm of fighting for justice in this sense, to me, it gets into the spiritual realm, because I think we disconnect ourselves. I think we become a club if we don't. I think we become a social club. And man, I'm over it. I'm not. I'm 52, and I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to play it. I'm going to say this stuff.
Yeah.
But it is a balance. Being in an established church and a brick and mortar church. And I think that dynamic is interesting, that you and I can talk about, because I have 150 years of an established church that's behind me, and with all this, and you're starting new. And I just wanted to ask you guys, what a privilege it is for you both to be able to start a church brand new and set the tone how you want it. How, I mean, what a privilege. I mean, it really is. It's got to be very exciting. I really think you guys are in a great position here with your church, because you don't have to look back. You can really set the tone. So how is that? I mean, it's much easier to be political when when you've got a new church start. It has to be.
It absolutely is. And that word that you use, privilege, is absolutely true. Because I was thinking about that before we got on the call. There's a second privilege that comes with it. You named it. We could set the tone. We're setting the culture. We have the vision that we're answering for God. And so basically, we're just answering that call. And whoever is into it is joining. Whoever isn't. We're not
Right.
so worried. We're not at all established, so we don't have to worry about losing members. It's just, do we fit with you or do we not?
Right.
But the other privileges that we have is that we don't get paid yet. We don't have salary attached. So, I mean, ultimately, we do need to get paid, right? Because in a world where you have to have money to live, like everybody
Right.
who's doing work needs to be justly compensated, right? But in the meantime, we're building a culture where we don't have that fear. And so I think that is sometimes, I think that, I named this with some ministers recently, is that our economic concerns sometimes enslave us to tradition in a way that is not godly, in the way that we're serving fear, not God.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, I don't want to lose my
building.
I don't want to lose my building. I don't want to lose my established families. I don't want to lose the membership numbers. I don't want to lose
Absolutely.
right money. What if the person who tithes the most, who because of their tithes we have this whole program, and if I piss them off, then they're going to leave, and then what happens to this program? They're practical fears and concerns. So I'm not saying you shouldn't worry about that, right? But I'm saying it adds a different sort of worldly pressure on what we're called to do spiritually.
Yeah.
And those can't always be disconnected cleanly. And so I think that's what happens sometimes in the church is, we're called as ministers. And if we're prophetic, we're called to speak the truth. However, we're humans and we need to eat and have a roof over our head. And we have our normal fears as human beings who are pastors. And so then I think sometimes we get sucked into tradition and culture, and it can't change because of the economic dynamics in there.
Yeah. In one word, yes.
That's really a spiritual attack on the believer.
Yeah.
To have a culture that's set up that is disconnected, there's that word again, from the system or the cycles of seed time and harvest, right? We go and swipe a card and we get whatever we want instantly. And so now seed time and harvest has been nullified. So now God is out of it. Now it's all supply chain driven. And if the supply chain is interrupted, then it's a problem, because there's time involved in God's process. So we're not going to turn around and do the microwave thing, with God's system.
Yeah.
That's man's way. And I think that is what was being offered to Jesus up on the hill, up on the mountain, when all the instant rewards were there. Yeah. You can have this right now. You don't have to suffer and bleed and die and do all of that stuff. Just take this. And I think that's really what the world is offering us. Hey, just take this and you don't have to work through it.
Absolutely. And that's that moves me into thinking about my own spirituality and how difficult it is for me to talk to folks in my congregation or anywhere. I did a jail ministry called Life After Meth for years. And to talk to folks about the length of time that it really takes to grow spiritually, and the amount of suffering that you have to accept in your life in order to do any substantial growing. And I talk about this in a lot of my videos on my channel, um, that it really is about accepting a certain amount of suffering in your life when things don't go your way in order to really truly develop spiritually. And that's the sense of, because we want to just, I see these signs throughout our town, God's got this. And I look at that and I just think, it's just like, well, I don't have to work. Grace is free. Everything's done for me. It's just, oh, God's got this. And it's a very Calvinistic way of looking at predestination and, original sin. And I don't want to burn in hell. So I'm just going to go ahead and accept that I go to church at a certain place and I espouse this political belief. So I'm automatically in. And I don't believe that.
Mhm.
I believe that there at any given time, I mean, I am susceptible to not making it to heaven.
Mm.
I'm at risk if I don't have my life in order, and if I die and while I'm dying I have uh, bitterness and anger and jealousy in my heart. I think that's a big deal.
Mm.
And so this whole sense that you constantly have to weed the garden type of idea. You guys put a garden out. I've got a garden out here at the house. You constantly have to work at it. And that work ethic, I think, is what you're talking about. This whole idea that really is a matter of trying to convey to people that it takes a tremendous amount of work to constantly, daily make sure, as my dad would say, that you're prayed up.
Prayed up, yeah.
You're prayed up. You're ready to go. And you have to, and Paul talks about it, with the armor of God. You got to put your armor on all the time. And I tell you, those lessons that I don't know about you guys in terms of spirituality, but that's what I learned is a real work ethic with my spirituality. And that's what I try to convey as a pastor, but also that's also in a very prophetic sense too, that if you're not prayed up and you don't have your armor on, it's not going to go well for you.
Right.
And I think that part of our armor is being in time, existing in time with God's process, because that's part of our protection from the collapse of systems.
I love that. Being in time with that's that sense of space and time. I love that idea because you really do have to just sit here, and that's very Zen, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
That I love that because you're sitting there going, you have to live in the here and now, right now, and that's what I love about the Eastern Christian Church, and some of the esoteric stuff that I'm into with Gurdjieff, and Ospensky and the Fourth Way. Is just this whole idea that being in the here and now, and how that concept for me changes how I do ministry.
Mm-hmm.
It changes how I preach. It changes how I counsel. It changes how I see the world. It changes even how I look at the news.
Mm-hmm.
Realizing that you have to be present and not to be swayed either way, because I've got people in my congregation who are folks who love to watch Fox News. I've got people who love to watch MSNBC.
Mm-hmm.
That's my burden to some extent, to sit here and say, how do I take that prophetic in a pastoral way? How do I take that prophetic message to them equally?
Right.
I think we're stumbling on something here. And in therapy, we talk a lot about, being present in your body. And we talk a lot about not living in past experiences of pain, or future fears of pain. And so when we talk about folks who are on one pole, one political pole versus the other pole, it sounds like to me that if we approach them with this mindfulness kind of, let's understand that we live in this moment as we breathe in or out, and that yes, it's true we lived in the past, but yes, it's also true that we are not alive in the past right now. Same thing with the future. We're actually alive in this moment as we breathe and blink and think. And so let's be present with each other as much as we can in those spaces.
You mean outside of ideology?
Yeah, outside of that, just meaning is inside of, being aware that we're in the now. Right. And we're experiencing whatever we're doing together, but it's right now. And because if you think about it, if you live in the past or if you live in the fear or hope of the future, there's a sort of death in that because
you're not
that's
living.
not alive.
Yeah.
Well, and
it's a projection.
And I was thinking about when both of you were talking is that part of the reason it's so hard to do that in this country specifically, I think, is because we don't like to live with discomfort. We don't like to be uncomfortable at all. And I'm saying particularly white people, particularly white people, I will say that because, we've had the certain level of unearned privilege that we don't recognize. I mean, some of us recognize it, but, some people don't because they think privilege means that they never suffered. And that's not what privilege means. It just means you didn't suffer like some other groups of people have suffered because of your skin color, because of your gender, because of who you love, right? That kind of stuff. But the thing that I've noticed is that in difficult conversations and emotional conversations is we're not taught emotional maturity. We're not taught emotional intelligence. Men especially are left out of that because they're socialized to suck it up, don't cry, don't have feelings, be intellectual only. And so when it comes to having an emotional conversation, it's too uncomfortable because people are like, oh, I feel terrible. My body hurts and I feel all this stuff that I can't quite name because I've never learned how to name my emotions. And so people, they don't want to deal with the discomfort because living in the moment means living in suffering, joy, fear, all of the emotions. And going through them rather than avoiding them. But what we're good at is avoiding.
Love that, because that absolutely, that sense of avoiding pain, I see it constantly, whether it's psychological or physical. And I think, trying to avoid this pain, whether it's, you see so many folks that whenever they have a sense of anxiety, the default setting for most Americans is, hey, if you have any kind of anxiety, first thing you need Xanax. You need some kind of benzodiazepine or something. And I'm telling you, working in a jail setting for over a decade and seeing people detox off of drugs, and then seeing people after several months, because you want to talk about longevity, when you, especially with meth addiction, it would take months and months for the brain to begin to repair itself.
Oh, wow.
Physically repair, like organically repair itself. And you would see them begin to feel again. And then they would start doing their step work, and they would get into that fourth step, and they would begin to make their list of all the people they resented. And their first instinct was, I don't want to do this anymore.
Right.
I don't want to feel this. I've never felt this, because drug addiction, and I don't want to get into this too much, but to me, drug addiction is just anger management.
And pain?
Pain management. It's all about managing things that make us uncomfortable. So, to see people, it was a privilege for me to be in the jail for that long and be able to watch people. And I'm sure in therapy, you see this too, begin to walk people through this process of feeling, just basic feeling pain. And what do you do with that? And where does God fit in to this when it just isn't taken away? Because to some extent, our God is the pain relievers that I take away my pain. Because God's supposed to take my pain away.
This is what I'm thinking, that anytime we rely on a pill or a substance to relieve us for things that are actually happening, like a lot of those people that are resented, they're resented by those folks for good reason. But instead of dealing with the reality of that situation, we turn to a substance.
Mm.
So whether we turn to it or we get the prescription from our doctor, that is still also the equivalent to me as a spiritual attack, because it does replace
The process.
not only does it replace God, but it replaces the chemical factory that we have in our skull that's designed to release the substances that we need when we need them. So if we replace those synthetically, then they shut off in the brain. So actually, again, that equals a spiritual attack, whether it's purposeful, whether it's out in the open as that or not. A lot of these reactive symptoms that we see in folks are justified because they're going through.
I agree completely on that. I mean, it's just the amount of folks that I see who just want the pain to be taken away is just, it's astronaut. It's just everywhere, and it's very difficult to do ministry with folks, whether it's in a church setting or jail or anywhere, and say, you know what, maybe you need to accept the unacceptable. I mean, that was what I was when I started to really get into some spiritual teachings. Guy named Durkheim, one of the quotes I love is, accepting the unacceptable is the beginning of spiritual wisdom.
Isn't that what
Accept,
he did?
what's that?
I say, isn't that what Jesus did? His whole example.
Absolutely. And accepting. So that mantra for me, I began when something was unacceptable, I had to look at it and say, well, maybe I need to accept this. And accepting it. I mean, I went through a divorce, and that divorce, when my son was 18 months old, I had to accept that.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't go out, and I had to learn how to forgive,
Mm-hmm.
and I had to actually sit here and say, well, all this stuff in the Beatitudes, wonder what that would look like in my life if I actually applied it.
Mm.
And it took me, day after day of accepting it through meditation, through doing the Jesus prayer,
Mm-hmm.
and accepting it. And now my son is 18 years old. He's graduated from high school next Friday.
Mm-hmm. Congrats.
And my ex-wife and I are friends. My wife Emily and is good friends with her. We get along,
Oh, good.
and just the fact of this forgiveness stuff that Jesus was talking about, it worked in my life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it did. It transformed me. It transformed how I see the world, and it allowed me to avoid all this toxicity and drama that I could have easily gotten into. But I know Jesus works. I know this Christianity stuff works because it worked in my life, and I think as pastors we have to apply these. We have to apply the teachings in our own life in order for us to be able to get up and have any kind of pastoral voice or prophetic voice.
Right. We have to practice what we preach. Because
Yeah.
if we don't know, why would anybody else? But when you talk about acceptance, and we were talking about living in the moment earlier. So before I started seminary, I went to visit my friend in Berlin. And she's very spiritual, but not in like a Christian sense. She's more like Buddhist and, just exploring, vibrations and all different kinds of things, right? And so this is right before I'm starting seminary. So it was a good break to hang out with her. But she said something that like made my brain just tweak. And that was, what you resist persists. And I was thinking, in terms of resisting like injustice and resisting like things that are bad, and like resist, it's like a fight call, resist.
Right.
That seems like a good thing. But then, I mean, I've been struggling. So it's been 5 years now that I've been struggling with that question. And then, it's the flip side to the acceptance.
Yeah.
And what's that kind of acceptance therapy? What is that called? AC acceptance.
ACT.
Yeah, acceptance and And what I learned is that sort of like acceptance is similar to what you were saying, like accepting the unacceptable. And it doesn't mean stop fighting against injustice. It doesn't mean
Right.
accept abuse. It doesn't mean anything like that. But what it means,
Acceptance and commitment.
oh, acceptance and commitment therapy, he said. But what it means
Yeah.
is accepting that in this moment, I am in this situation. I don't know what I'm supposed to learn from it. I don't know who is supposed to learn something from it. I just know that the only thing I can do right now is accept that right now I feel angry.
Yeah.
Right now I feel lonely. Right now I'm overwhelmed by the injustice of the world. Right now, and the more you can accept it, you can like deal with the feelings around it. And it does help you go through it. So then on the flip side, if you are spending all of your time like, I don't want to deal with that, I don't want to deal with that, I don't want to deal with that, you're doing drugs, any of the addictions, right? You're doing addictions to numb the pain, avoid the problem. And as you know, the more people avoid, which is resist the feelings, it gets to be deeper problems. So again, that's sort of a mix between Buddhism and Christianity, but like
Absolutely.
living in the now is the key there, and accepting what is. It doesn't mean you can't change things, but you just have to accept this is the part of the journey where it's not changed yet. And what can I do differently, and how can I accept what is right in front of me?
Absolutely.